Hey everyone, I'm Athuada. I used to debate for Wesley College, and this video is part of the Sri Lanka Debaters Council's motion debrief. The motion being done during the Lakshman Kadiragamar Memorial Challenge Shield. This house prefers a world where all writing is pseudonymous. When debating a this house prefers a world motion, it's important to understand that proposition has built up this new world from scratch. What does this mean? Let's put it within the context of this debate. When you say this house prefers a world where all writing is pseudonymous, what this means is that ever since the beginning of mankind's writing, all writing has been pseudonymous. It does not matter how this happened, the implications of it are what is to be debated. And why is it actually important to understand this concept? Because it changes certain mindsets and certain logics within how these two worlds operate. For example, within status quo, within our actual world, that opposition is that we are currently living in, rather, authors might believe that they deserve certain recognition and that they deserve certain respect for the works that they put out. However, within side proposition's world, since everybody since birth assumes that they deserve no respect and assumes that work should have pseudonymity, they might not have any problem with not having their identity associated with their work. What then is the framing that proposition needs to bring about in this debate? Number one, it's important that they point out that this debate is not about the technicalities associated with this debate. For example, how do you maintain pseudonymity? How are taxes going to be filed? This debate is not about how pseudonymity is going to be maintained or exactly how it's going to be protected. But rather, it's about pseudonymity exists. So what is going to happen? Is it going to be good or is it going to be bad? Any debate otherwise is not within the spirit of the motion. The second piece of framing then that proposition has to bring about is what exactly is pseudonymous. Pseudonymous within this situation can mean you're writing consistently under a particular fake name. But it is also within proposition's fiat to be able to say that, look, if an author feels like a pseudonym is too hot for them to handle anymore, they can ditch that pseudonym and move on to a new one. The third piece of framing that proposition then brings about is what exactly is writing referred to in this motion. Writing within this motion would ideally have a very broad spectrum. For example, things like fiction work, non-fiction work, scientific journals, newspaper columns all fall under writing. What then is prop's problem with the current world? And it's important to understand that prop has to have a big problem. Because proposition is envisioning an entirely new world. For you to envision an entirely new world, there has to be a very, very big problem with the current one. So what exactly is this problem that's so prevalent within the writing sphere? The most prevalent problem is bias existing within the writing sphere. Let's understand the context here. How exactly or where exactly is this bias applied? This bias can come about at two stages. One, it can come about in the publishing stage. Let's understand the context here. Authors generally don't sell their own books. Rather, they hand their books to publishing companies which then invest in it and therefore publish the books themselves and market it through their channels. This is the same thing with, say, scientific papers which are handed over to scientific journals to be reviewed and to be published. But the issue with this type of model is that publishing companies tend to have biases within their own systems. For example, let's say the American publishing environment. Within America, when you publish a fiction work, women tend to have an unfair advantage over men. What does this mean? This means that women tend to be published more, they tend to be marketed more, they tend to be given more opportunities by publishing companies, in contrast to men. But when you look at the non-fiction genre, when you look at scientific journals, when you look at archaeology papers and whatnot, men tend to be very dominant. Men tend to be very prevalent. Therefore, it is very likely that men have an unfair advantage within these types of spheres. But that's just with gender. Even things like race, even things like sexuality can be applied when deciding whether or not a book should be published. This racism or this sexism or this misogyny could either be overt or subconscious. But what matters is that this type of bias generally overrides a publisher's incentive to make more cash. Let me make this a bit more clear. It's not that publishing companies don't care about making a profit. Let's assume that I am a signalist publisher who is subconsciously racist. I get a signalist book written by a signalist author that is going to make some amount of profit. Then I get another book written by, say, a Tamil author that is going to get marginally higher profits. Now, if you are running on a meritocratic system, I'd give the Tamil author the publication because that is going to earn me more profits. But since I have a subconscious bias, I am going to cave into that bias and give it to the signalist person. So it's not that I am making a loss, it's that I might have made more profit. And the distinction there is very important because companies still care about profit. But giving into subconscious bias, they may be okay with quelling that profit a bit, reducing the meritocracy a bit in order to satisfy their own overt or subconscious biases. Where then is the second stage where this type of bias exists? This is within readers themselves, when they pick a book off the shelves or select something like a newspaper column to read. Readers tend to also have subconscious or overt bias and tend to act upon them as well. If I am much more inclined to read a work by someone of my race, my sex, my religion, I am likely going to pick that work over something that might have more reviews, that might be more satisfying. Granted, this does not always happen, but proposition can frame the debate in a way where people act in this type of way and where the vast majority of people do on some level give in to these types of bias. How then does prop go about removing this? What prop says is, look, what happens when pseudonymity is applied? You sever the link between the author's identity and their work. What this means is that a new metric is necessary to decide what book gets published and what book a reader is going to consume. Prop then has the burden of telling us what exactly this system is going to be. So let's imagine to ourselves, in this world, there cannot be any subconscious bias or overt bias because there is no link between the author and the work. Therefore, it is highly likely that what's going to exist is a meritocratic system. But why is this likely? Because in the absence of satisfying their bias, people like company executives, people within the upper echelons of the company want to make the maximum amount of profit. Therefore, companies are likely to prioritize their profit, and good books, better books tend to earn more profit. The same thing with newspaper columns, the same thing with research journals, the same thing with scientific journals. Therefore, publishing companies adopt a much more meritocratic system. But readers also adopt the same because they also start realizing that they can't give in to their biases because they don't know the author whatsoever. So they'd much rather have a book or read an article that they enjoy or that they can learn the maximum amount of information from the time that they invested. What then are the impacts of this argument? The first is obvious, is that you create a fairer environment and that is always better. But why does this impact become much larger? Because a fairer environment means that more authors are inclined to write. Men are not going to stay away from the fiction field just because it's female dominant now, because everybody has a fair shot. Women are not going to stay away from scientific journals because it's a male dominated sphere. Even they can have a shot there now. When everybody has an equal playing field, everybody feels like they have a shot at making it. Therefore, everybody is inclined to write what they feel like writing. But what is the impact of this? Obviously, more works are going to come out, and as a direct result, your life is going to have a larger pool of work to select from, therefore able to pick out better quality work. But the second impact then is that publishing companies adopting a meritocratic system means that they only pick the best of the best. Good work that might have been on the chopping block within status quo, on proposition's world, ends up actually being published, and therefore consumers have the ability to consume these kinds of work. The third impact then is on the consumer themselves, because if I gave into my bias, I might have been restricted from certain utility that I could have otherwise obtained. But now, with all of our biases gone towards the author, since we don't know who they are, and since we tend to prioritize our own investment of time and therefore want to get the most out of it, we are much more likely to pick things that we enjoy a lot more. So authors are treated better. This leads to more work being produced. This leads to better quality work. This leads to more publishing companies adopting better filtering systems, but also the consumer has a much better experience. You bring all of these impacts towards all these stakeholders together and you have a very, very powerful argument. But this cannot be the only problem within status quo. But there is another problem that exists within the writing sphere. A big problem that exists is that oftentimes authors are stifled and are unable to express their own opinions within their own works. What is the context here? The context here is that, look, you have things like doxing, you have things like death threats, you have things like personal attacks onto authors. And what this means is that authors are generally inhibited from expressing their own opinion, or by expressing their full opinion. They might express it partially, but not completely. Now, opposition can obviously come up and say, oh look, but why not, but even within status quo, pseudonymity exists. But prop then has to tell us why exactly this pseudonymity is unique on their side. Because in a world where pseudonymity might exist versus in a world where pseudonymity definitely exists, there has to be a difference between these two. The difference then that prop can allude to is that, look, if pseudonymity is optional, people are going to move towards a much more relatable character. People are going to move towards a human being that they are able to identify with, that they are able to, say, look into should the need arise. Therefore, within status quo, pseudonymous works aren't as prevalent as works with an identity attached towards them. But within the world that prop is creating, nobody has an identity. Therefore, every work becomes equally viable. Why then is allowing more freedom of expression for these types of authors so important? Importantly, because it allows radical and out-of-the-box thinking and radical and out-of-the-box ideas to be sent out through this type of work. Now, intuitively, when you start thinking radical ideas, people's minds immediately think to things like, say, neo-Nazism or white supremacy. But that is not necessarily the case. Prop has to break down why these types of radical ideas can be incredibly helpful. Let's break it down in a simple example. Let's take ourselves back to the time where, say, slavery was a common thing and where owning people as objects was a common thing. During this time, saying that all people deserve equal rights or slavery should not exist is a very radical idea. It's a very out-of-the-box idea. Therefore, what we can conclude from that is radical out-of-the-box ideas are necessary in order to propagate social discussion and better society overall. At some point, maybe saying women deserve abortions was a terrible thing to say, but now it is the progressive thing to say. The reason why this shift happened was because the paradigms of society shifted. The reason why paradigms of society shifted is because people started speaking out against certain systems that existed that they believed were wrong. Now, prop can then tell us that, look, when pseudonymity exists, authors aren't scared of being attacked. When authors aren't scared of being attacked, they're able to freely express their opinions and freely express their views. What this means is that you're much more likely to have a wider pool of ideas circulate in society, which is going to include a lot of non-conventional ideas. Social discourse happens as an obvious result of this, and therefore society is able to filter out ideas and therefore able to build a better society through better ideas that arise. A concession that prop has to make is that always the ideas that get implemented from this are not going to be good ideas. What this means is that there can be certain mistakes, there can be certain bad ideas that are taken up, but what matters is that society is constantly pressured to change. And since humans are capable of empathy, since humans are capable of some level of intelligence above other beings, we should be able to take all this information and at some point make the correct choice. You could ground this argument further by talking about things like, say, scientific research. Within things like scientific paradigms, then you tend to have very set parameters within which experiments happen, within which research happens. And the reason why especially young writers are very, very uncomfortable calling this out is because they're usually shunned within their own communities. But within a world where pseudonymity exists, you're able to question much more, and therefore you're able to break a lot more boundaries, present your ideas much more fearlessly, and this is going to create a better society overall. Even if racist and sexist ideas are given out, discussing these ideas within society is better than bottling them up. And there's an important distinction that proposition then has to be. Let's run through how opposition can go about this debate. Opposition has to prove that the world that we currently live in, that is status quo, is superior to the world that side proposition portrays. So what they have to realize is that the harms that side proposition accrue on their world outweigh the benefits that they portray, and or that the benefits that exist within status quo are far superior to the benefits that proposition can claim within their new world. So let's think about it a bit. Why exactly is pseudonymity unapplicable in this world right now? It's because authors would not like it. But why don't authors like it? It's because human beings have a natural tendency to want respect, to want recognition. The context here being that writing itself is not an incredibly profitable profession. You can gain some profit from it, but it's not an exorbitant amount of profit. Oftentimes, it's unrewarding work. But what compels a lot of people to do this type of work is the type of recognition that you get, is the type of name spreading that you get within society where everyone knows your name. This is especially true in things like, say, scientific journals, where young scientists really want the outside world to know their names for some famous invention, for some famous research. The analysis here then is that you remove this prideful aspect that people have. You remove their ability to be prideful. You remove their capability to tap into a legacy and create a legacy for themselves by creating a line of work with their name attached towards it. The argument here is not that the people themselves will be dissatisfied, because Prop is able to say that you created this world from scratch, so these people don't expect recognition. That is true. But the argument that Op can make is, look, people who got into writing because of this type of recognition, people who felt like the low amount of profit was worth the recognition, these are the type of people who end up spilling out. These are the type of people who end up not being able to write anymore, or not feeling like it's worth it to write anymore. But why exactly is this bad? It's pretty obvious. It's because less and less people moving into writing means that you have a lesser quality, or rather lesser amount of writing to select from, which obviously means a lesser quality of writing. But also a decrease in the competition within these types of writing environments is likely also going to lead in a decrease in quality for the writers who already write. Therefore, this is going to have a drastic impact on both the quantity and the quality of works that are going to be put out into society. But let's move further than that. What then is another problem that opposition can portray, another argument that they can put out? What is the main thing that we think about when we think about anonymity and pseudonymity and its social implications? There's something that comes out very prevalently in things like social media. It's the lack of accountability surrounding these types of anonymous and pseudonymous names. The context here being that you generally can't trace who is behind these identities, and therefore you cannot hold them accountable for their actions. This flips proposition's argumentation on freedom of expression. How then are you going to frame this into an argument? You can point out that manipulation and misinformation is much more probable under proposition's new world. How is this true? One, you can point out things like astroturfing could happen. This means that governments flood the literary sphere with works that coerce people to believe their narrative. So if governments or powerful people have certain agendas, they can flush down a lot of literary works under different pseudonyms with the help of different people, and therefore coerce certain parts of society to believe their own side of the story. In a world where pseudonymous works are viewed with skepticism, this is not going to be very possible. That is to say, the world that we live in right now. But in a world where pseudonymity is the norm, this becomes a highly probable scenario, and that is incredibly problematic. The second thing that you can point out under this is about misinformation. Let's break it down on a very simple level. Let's talk about things like, say, flat earthers. In a world where there's countless experiments and research and practical evidence for the earth being a sphere, you still have a lot of people who insist that the earth is flat. Let's assume that we are in propositions world. A geography professor with years of research, with a degree, who is an expert in the field, would have the same amount of legitimacy as a TikTok creator who believes that the earth is flat. Now, this seems to be intuitively problematic. And the reason why this is true is because pseudonymity also means that you can't put up your degrees. You can't show your diplomas, you can't show your educational background. Therefore, everyone's work is equally valid. The problem is that this makes it incredibly difficult for people to pick and choose what information is right and what information is wrong, especially since people won't be exposed to all ideas because the reading time that people have is very limited, thus increasing the probability of misinformation happening. But you could also talk about how another form of manipulation can happen. About how certain individuals might have ill will towards certain communities and can write pseudonymously in order to hurt them. What does this look like? This looks like neo-Nazis writing as Jewish Holocaust survivors and saying that, you know what, the Holocaust didn't actually happen and that it was all a scam. Certain individuals who are racist, misogynistic, sexist could use pseudonymous names in order to propagate their own versions of the story, and it becomes much more hurtful because, like I said before, people don't read every single opinion out there. So someone who is only exposed to this opinion might actually believe that it's true. So there's three metrics by which manipulation and misinformation is possible. An argument that opposition can use to push back on the idea of freedom of expression and say, look, at some point freedom of expression needs to be sacrificed in order for us to protect these types of communities and protect overall society. The third idea then that we can bring about is that oftentimes identities existing creates a good thing for the consumer. What does this mean? This means that consumers are able to do two things. One, they're able to verify and make sure that the work that they're reading is credible. Two, they're able to make the work that they're reading much more compelling and interesting. Let's break this down. How exactly do consumers see these types of authors and see their identities, and how do they work with these identities? Let's move back to that Holocaust example. If I wanted to read about the Holocaust and what happened in say Auschwitz, it would be much more better for me to read from the perspective of a Holocaust survivor. Therefore, once I see the identity and I look into it and I realize that the author is a Holocaust survivor, I am likely to believe that that's a credible source and that's probably a legitimate way to go about it. However, if I look at another author and turns out that this guy has been, say, on Facebook tweeting neo-Nazi things or on TikTok doing like white supremacy stuff, I'm obviously not going to think that he's a legitimate author. And opposition can point out that this is a very fair metric for making sure that you filter out good writers, or rather writers who would not have a bias in whatever you're reading about. And once again, the reason for a necessity for filtering is obvious. Humans cannot read everything, every single idea out there, therefore they need to selectively pick certain ideas. It's important that they know which ideas that they're reading as a direct result. But the second thing that you can point out then is that it just makes a much more interesting read. You knowing the author's background, you knowing what they went through, you knowing their unique perspective, you knowing their life experience can bring an entirely new perspective to books. It can completely change the way that you view artwork, and it can completely change the way that you use the information in that artwork within your own life, creating a very real impact. Opposition can also run a principled line here. That is that authors deserve credit for the type of work that they do. And it is quite frankly true, because essentially proposition's work is forcing a sense of anonymity on all authors. And that might not be entirely fair considering the amount of work that they put into it. But ideally, this would not be your key debate winning argument, because proposition is likely going to call out on that and bring this debate down to practical impact, thus making the other three arguments, the ones about manipulation and misinformation, the ones about a better reading experience, and the ones about removing incentive to write, far more important.